Welcome to History 394, Southeast Asia, Week 4. This week, next week, we're looking at Burma. The nation currently known as Myanmar. And this, I think, is a very good map to introduce you to where it is located, just to the east of India and Bangladesh. So here's the Bay of Bengal over here. And to the east of Burma, or Myanmar, is Thailand and Laos. And to the north is China. The major city is Rangoon, which used to be the capital of British Burma, now called Yangon. Here you see the Andaman Sea, and running from north to south are two very important rivers, the Irrawaddy River and the Salween River. And these contain some very fertile plains down here where there's a lot of rice grown. As you go to the north and the east of the country, the plateaus and hills begin, heading towards up here the Yunnan province of China, and of course up here, Tibet, which is of course very mountainous. So the further north you go, the more mountainous it is. I think this is a great map because it illustrates very clearly the book that we're reading for this section of the Southeast Asia course by Thant Myint U, called Where China Meets India, Burma and the New Crossroads of Asia. The book, just to kind of summarize it for you, is really going to talk a lot about Burma, but also it's going to go into the politics of nearby China and India. And really you can see why they're doing that. You can see the world's most populous country, still a communist nation, but having taken on a lot of market economy reforms since the 1970s, is China right here, and India over here, which is the world's second most populous nation and the world's largest democracy. So what are some of the things that Thant Myint U says? Hereafter we'll just refer to his book as Thant. He says that Burma, Myanmar, is very ethnically diverse. In fact, it is the most diverse in continental Southeast Asia. One thing that he talks about, and that we need to kind of help us to distinguish what's happening in countries like Burma and some of these developing nations, is partly the result of colonialism. In terms of the British, when they ruled over Burma, and if you recall, Burma really was meant as a sort of state to be between British-ruled India and over here Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, which of course were composed of French Indochina. And then there was also, this separate nation of Siam, later on called Thailand. The British generally approached their colonial empire in a very kind of pragmatic way. First of all, there were areas where they ruled directly. And in the case of, say, if we look back here in this Irrawaddy Valley area here, around Rangoon and other places along the coast, the British would have ruled with direct rule. That is, they literally replaced the king, the Burmese king, and in fact exiled the king to Calcutta in India, and they replaced the aristocracy under him, and they replaced it with British colonial officials. Okay, that worked in the more urban areas, the more agricultural plains along the coastline. But what about when you got into eastern portions of Burma, up in the area of the Salween River, when you got into the areas of the plateaus, the Shan Hills, as things became more mountainous, as things became more jungle-like, and as things were more rural and isolated, in those areas the British practiced indirect rule. So that literally meant that they still kept the tribal leaders in place, and they tried to get tribal leaders to cooperate with them, and so they ruled the people indirectly. And then in some cases, the British really had very little influence over the peoples in those areas. So again, it was a very kind of pragmatic rule. The other thing that we want to look at is between 1962 and 2011, for almost 50 years, a military junta ruled Burma. And for the first part of this, they really wanted to build a kind of a socialist regime, and they also wanted to isolate Burma from the rest of the world. So if you've taken my Japan class, you know that, for a long time, Japan isolated itself from the outside world until in the 1850s, the United States literally burst open the doors of Japan. Similarly, Burma, and this is kind of really astonishing because this is a 20th century phenomenon, really succeeded in isolating Burma generally pretty much economically from the rest of the world. And of course the result was just horrible. It became one of the poorest countries around. What do we know about Burma? Well, it is ethnically diverse, and it is 85% Buddhist. Other important religions include Christianity and Islam. And remember that the followers of Islam are called Muslims. We just showed you the importance of the Irrawaddy River and the Salween River. Another thing that's going to become very important when you read over Thant's book, Where China Meets India, is this whole idea expressed by President Hu Jintao of China in 2003 when he referred to China's Malacca Dilemma. Now, we already looked at in prior lectures the Straits of Malacca and the importance of the amount of worldwide trade that passes through the Straits of Malacca, and especially of oil. And China is very dependent on imported oil passing through the Malacca Straits, and it worries about the Malacca Straits, not only because, piracy has been a problem there, remains really a problem worldwide. In fact, we're really seeing shipping companies really hire their own mercenaries worldwide to defend themselves against pirates. And so, as China worries about its Malacca Dilemma, in that, one power, somebody could block the straits and, literally cut off much of its oil supply, China has been very interested of late in Burma, and in fact is building a pipeline through Burma so that there is natural gas that will be available to the inner portions, especially of Western China. So keep that in mind. China's role in Burma in the 21st century is increasing very rapidly and is very important. Now, when Thant writes in Where China Meets India about Yunnan and the capital of Yunnan at Kunming, and when he talks about Xishan, which we know is Tibet, he is speaking about not Burma itself, but about Chinese provinces which neighbor this northeastern section of Burma, that is present-day Myanmar. And the reason why he goes into such detail about Yunnan and Tibet is because they have such a great economic influence on Burma in the 21st century, especially since the launching of China's Western Development Strategy in 1999. And the Western Development Strategy of China is simply this. We all know that major cities like the capital of China, Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Hong Kong, other cities are developing very rapidly. They're industrializing. They're growing in terms of population, and they're becoming modern cities with modern industries and shopping centers and coffee shops, Starbucks, McDonald's, Kentucky Fried Chicken, the whole, however we define civilization these days. But where the rest of China has not caught up is in the western portions of China. So as you go out into the provinces like Yunnan and Xishan and others. And so China is very much interested in improving the economic development in those areas, and it's doing so by building airports, by building roads, especially expressways. Soon it'll have more miles of expressways than even the United States. And so hence it's opening up the interior to transportation. And transportation, of course, is absolutely vital to the growth of any economy and to try to bring up the GDP of those peoples who live in the western and kind of northwestern and southwestern parts of China. Now, just to tell you a little bit about Yunnan, in the 700s AD, the kingdom of Nanzhao, so-called Dali, and its capital there at Dali, ruled over this area of Yunnan, which is partly along the Yangtze River. And he's going to refer to that, Thant, in his work Where China Meets India. Later it became the kingdom of Gandhara with its capital at Dali, and in the 1200s AD it was defeated by the Mongols. So, you know, the Mongols in the 1200s took over a vast portion of Eurasia, including this area of Yunnan and even down into what was Burma. Now, when Thant starts talking about Yunnan and so forth, just kind of read those chapters that don't specifically deal with Burma rather quickly. Because, again, he's making an argument about the importance of those neighboring provinces, those neighboring areas to Burma. And that's part of his thesis, but we're not really looking at the history of those places because they're outside of Burma. So, again, read them rather quickly and don't get too caught up in all of the details. Another thing that Thant is saying is that large portions of northern and northeastern Myanmar, such as the Shan Hills, are controlled still to this day by former guerrillas. And the Burmese army has been trying for many decades to control these former guerrillas. It's brought them essentially to kind of a ceasefire. And those guerrillas include the Kachin Independence Army, also called the KIA, and the United Wa State Army, the UWSA. Many of these organizations, like the USWA, govern over, for all intents and purposes, a territory larger than, the country of Belgium. And they're involved in illegal things like drugs and gambling and so forth. So this is problematic. So you may ask that question of how does this stuff kind of happen? Again, we get back to the whole idea that Burma is very ethnically diverse, but it's also a very poor country. It's a developing country. And just as in the case where the British could apply direct rule to those areas that were more populated, that had more agriculture, like rice production, and were more along the plains and the coastline, so too the country of Myanmar can control these areas of Burma really proper better than they can the outlying and outpost areas where that are much less populated, much less developed, more poor, and not as the access to is very, very difficult in terms of transportation. And you really do start to get into the plateaus and the mountainous areas. You get into the interior of the Asian continent. So it is not surprising then that this is happening and still happens in Myanmar when you get out into the outlying areas. It's like if you take a pebble and you throw it into a lake, right, and you get the waves, but farther and farther away from where the rock lands, you know, those waves, those ripples are getting farther and farther apart. That very oftentimes happens in countries. It certainly happened in ancient medieval times, and it happens in areas of the world that are largely still developing nations. So, what do we know about Burma itself? Well, in circa 1500 BC, there was a civilization in Upper Burma that smelted bronze, grew rice, domesticated animals like chickens and pigs. It had already entered into an Iron Age, you know, smelting iron by about 500 BC. And by about 122 BC, as Stan says, and where China meets India, Chinese envoys were being sent to the kingdom of Dian in present-day Yunnan province of China. Now, circa 1050 AD, the city-state, and we're going to show you right here, there's Tungu and Bagan and Ava. Those are all important areas, see, along the Irrawaddy River, essentially, of Burma. So the city-state of Bagan grew into the Burmese kingdom of Bagan. It was a Buddhist kingdom, and so many beautiful Buddhist temples still remain in that entire area. And this was really one of the first important kingdoms of Burma. Now, Bagan also ended with the invasion of the Mongols. And about the same time, these Shan peoples, these Shan immigrants living in the Shan Hills, and Tant's going to talk about them, also arrived at the same time as the Mongols did. Now, it's interesting to see that after the Mongols, I mean, what happened really worldwide, we know this, you know, after the Mongols were repulsed, there was a lot of sort of division and lack of unity in the places that they had held. You know, it was, you know, simply the military might of the Mongols that held together an empire for a very short time. But in the 1200s AD, I mean, it was, they weren't living in the global world of transportation and communications that we are now. And it was very easy for empires to form and then to literally fall apart. And so several states emerged in the area of Burma, including Ava, Hanthawaddy, Arakan, and the Confederation of Shan States. Oh, there we go, Shan States again. In the 1400s, in the city of what is now Rangoon or Yangon, Thant talks about the beautiful Shwedagon Pagoda that was built, you know, and the lower portions of that in gold leaf, and you know, it's a Buddhist pagoda, and then the upper portions including precious jewels. By the 1540s, through the 1752, a very powerful kingdom of Tungu, with its capital at Ava, near what is now Mandalay, ruled over much of Burma. And in 1752, it was defeated, and instead a restored Hanthawaddy kingdom arose. And it's really the dynasty related from them that will continue on ruling over large parts of Burma and taking over more and more territory in the area of the Bay of Bengal and what we today really call Bangladesh. Well, we know that moving into the area by the 1700s was the British East India Company, which eventually, you know, took over pretty much all of India. And with the Sepoy Mutiny, pretty well everything went from the British East India Company in 1858 and was really in India directly taken over by Queen Victoria and by Britain itself. But before the kind of end of the British East India Company's rule over India in the 1850s, it was a monopoly company that was given literally the monopoly of trade with the East Indies. And so it eventually would come to blows with the Burmese dynasty that was ruling. And a series really of 3 wars Britain would fight. 1824 to 26, the First Anglo-Burmese War. The British East India Company gained territory on the Bay of Bengal. In the 1850s, 1852, the Second Anglo-Burmese War. The British took the very important area of Rangoon. The 1850s, King Mindon of Burma took the throne from his half-brother because he saw how the kingdom really was falling apart. He modernized Burma in many ways and moved the capital from Amapura and built a new capital at Mandalay. And Mandalay is going to be one of the places that Thant visits in where China meets India. And I'm giving you some page numbers here because, again, Thant's book is interesting, especially when he gets to the more modern parts of how China and India are, really wrestling with this whole issue of Burma, and Burma kind of wrestling with itself and the Burmese people as to how they're going to emerge into and become a part of really the modern world and increase productivity, and hopefully prosperity will come with that as well. So when we look at all of this, and Thant in his book Where China Meets India begins to get mired down somewhat in details about the history. Feel free to just take out your handy dandy PowerPoint, having listened to my lecture, and know that you don't need to become all mired down in those details with him. Like lots of modern authors, he's going back and forth according to locations and back and forth in time. So let his examples of history followed by present day, let those influence you more than getting caught in the history itself. That's why I'm giving you this nice little overview history, so that you don't have to get mired down in this kind of detail. In the 1850s and the 1860s, China was a mess, and we cannot discuss the history of Burma, I'm sounding like I'm from the East Coast, Burma, unless we talk about what's happening in China and what's happening with Britain and India, because those are the 2 big players. Well, China was falling apart in the 1850s and 60s, a major rebellion called the Taiping Rebellion, which killed millions of people in China. And during that time, Muslims moved into the province of Yunnan, neighboring Burma, but the province in China, and really took over that in the northern borderland area. So that's where you start getting some Muslims moving in. In 1885, there was a 3rd Anglo-Burmese War. By this time, the British East India Company is out of the picture. Britain is, from 1858 on, directly ruling over India. And Britain defeated Burma, and the Burmese king was exiled to Calcutta in India. On January 1st, 1886, Burma became a part of the British-ruled India, and it would remain a part of British-ruled India until 1937, when it be separated from India and it became its own British colony of Burma. Subsequently, Britain encouraged immigrants from India and China. Britain thought highly of the enterprising commercial Chinese, of the Indians from India. It looked kind of down on the Burmese. It didn't see them as being able to really bring about the kinds of agricultural, industrial, and mining enterprises that it wanted to pursue in Burma. The end result was, under the British, Burma did develop and actually had a higher standard of living than India. And Rangoon was the largest immigrant port in the world, even bigger than New York City. So this is where, again, Burma, attracting Indians, Chinese, already ethnically diverse, becomes even more ethnically diverse. And it attracts all kinds of Europeans who are engaged in enterprises. One example that Thant gives in Where China Meets India is that George Orwell lived for a time in Mandalay in Burma. Now we need to shift to Japan, because everybody knows what Japan was doing in the 1930s, trying to create this Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, which was a euphemism, of course, for it just wanting to take over Asia and make it, an empire. Already by the 1930s, the Japanese attacked China, and the U.S. and other nations were very concerned that, China would completely fall to the Japanese. So in the 1930s, the U.S. and others began building the Burma Road. It's a very important road through Burma to supply the Chinese, again, the Chinese back door, so to speak, against the Japanese. 1937, as we said, Burma became a separate British colony. In 1940, there were already people wanting to establish, Burmese people, including the great leader Aung San. And Aung San is going to be the father of another great and present-day leader of Burma, who we're going to discuss here in a minute. Aung San established the Burma Independence Army in Japan. So, he's doing this in Japan before World War II starts. And in fact, the Burma Independence Army, a lot of them fought on the side of Japan in World War II. So they were not at all happy with British rule over Burma. In 1942, during World War II, the Japanese seized the Burma Road, so they cut it off so the Americans could no longer supply the Chinese in their own struggles against the Japanese. The Japanese also seized Burma, so they worked themselves all the way down the continent down to Rangoon, and the British were just retreating right in front of them. The U.S. built a new road from Lado called the Lado or Stilwell Road to supply China during World War II. And by 1948, of course, by 1945, the war was over. The Allies had retaken Burma. And in 1948, Britain pretty well decided, India is getting its independence. What is the use of holding on to Burma once India was independent? So Britain granted Burma its independence, and it was a democracy, although some civil war was occurring in parts of Burma. In 1949, some nationalist forces fled to Burma. These are Chinese nationalist forces after the communist forces of Mao Zedong won in China. So now, again, don't forget, we always have to look at the British, right? We always have to look at the Chinese. But the Brits are gone now. The Brits are gone after World War II. Burma is on its own, but Burma has to worry a great deal about Communist China, 1949. And some of those nationalist forces of Chiang Kai-shek himself, who had been fighting Mao Zedong and the communist forces in China, he lost. He fled to Taiwan, the island of Taiwan. But not all the nationalist forces fled to Taiwan. Some came to Burma. And so that is part of what is going to happen in that northeastern section of Burma as some of these nationalist forces are fleeing, they're refugees to Burma, and they're interested still in invading China. They're still hoping at some point in time they can take China back from the communists. By 1960, there was a joint Burmese-China military operation along the border that cleared out a lot of the remaining Chinese nationalists. But remember, a lot of these had already settled down and they had intermarried among the Burmese tribes up in that area. So, again, the area from early times is subject to all kinds of insurgencies, rebellion, etc. Well, one thing that was really pretty great was U Thant of Burma, and U kind of means Mr., became Secretary General of the United Nations in 1961. So he was Burmese. Unfortunately, a year later, a military junta led by General Ne Win took over Burma. This is that military junta that it'll change over the years, but the military will essentially control Burma for 49 years, from 1962 to 2011. And so Burma, which had been a democracy, albeit a fledgling democracy, now under General Ne Win becomes a socialist country. And he calls it the Burmese way to socialism, which is essentially we're going to isolate the country because we can't trust all of these people like Americans and Indians and everybody. They'll get in here and they'll just, make it some capitalistic power. And we really can't, trust too much China and others. We're just going to do it our own way, the Burmese way to socialism. And much of it was an agricultural focus. Well, needless to say, the world was industrializing right and left. It was becoming modernized. And under the Burmese way to socialism, Burma just sort of stagnated. In the late 1960s, Cultural Revolution occurred in China. And China stirred up communist insurgents in Burma. And the Burmese retaliated later in the year, in June of 1967, with riots against Chinese people in Burma. So there's a very uncomfortable set of relations occurring in the 1960s and early 1970s between Burma and China. And this continues in 1968 when Burmese communist insurgents supported by military officers from China invaded eastern portions of Burma, and a 20-year civil war ensued. And although there have been, as we said, ceasefires, still there's an unease, there's just sort of a forced peace, and there are all these insurgent powers still kind of controlling large areas of north and northeastern Burma. In 1974, a new constitution for Burma proclaimed a Socialist Republic of the Union of Burma. By the late 1970s, reforms in China eased up support of Burmese communists. And this was happening because China was undergoing kind of its own very early market reforms. And China became interested in just pursuing policies that would make the Chinese more prosperous. And hence it eased up on its support of communists really around the world. By 1987, clearly the Socialist Republic of the Union of Burma, the Burmese way to socialism, was a disaster, as the UN named Burma as one of the 10 poorest nations in the world. Not surprisingly, there were student revolts and a pro-democracy movement in 1988 that unfortunately was crushed. It was obvious that the old government, the old junta, wasn't really able to control the situation, so a new junta, military junta, seized control, calling itself the State Law and Order Restoration Council. It was later renamed the State Peace and Development Council in 1997. Well, they overthrew the 1974 Constitution and slowly began to open up Burma to the rest of the world and to open up the economy. In 1989, we come to that daughter of that very early independence leader, Aung San, and her name is Aung San Suu Kyi. She was the leader of the government's opposition National League for Democracy. And her efforts at trying to change the system won her the Nobel Peace Prize in 1989. That same year, she was placed under house arrest by the Burmese government, and that same year, SLORC changed the name of the nation to the Union of Myanmar. we'll come back to Aung San Suu Kyi. In 1990 elections, the NLD, which is the National League of Democracy, won 3/4 of the seat in the Burmese legislature, but the SLORC, that is the ruling military junta, declared the election null and void. The U.S. and European countries followed up with sanctions against Burma, and Phant has a lot to say about what he regards as the ineffectiveness of those sanctions in his book Where China Meets India. And we know that from the time of the Vietnam War on, which really kind of increased the market for drugs in the United States and in that whole area of Southeast Asia, there were, and they probably really were at their height, opium warlords in the so-called Golden Triangle of Burma and Thailand and Laos there. And they operated and to much effectiveness and once were the world's largest really producers of opium. A situation, of course, which later on would be overtaken by, Afghanistan. The Burmese-China border opened, however, to trade, and natural gas was discovered offshore Burma. By 1995, relations between Burma and India were thawing. They were getting better. And then just about that time, a major crisis hit the Asian tigers and the Asian financial giants, such as Japan itself. And it was a crisis that really was revolving around kind of a real estate bubble that burst. Sound familiar? It sounds very much like our 2008 real estate bubble that burst in the United States and sent the United States and Europe into a tailspin and into a terrible recession. So just as things were kind of improving in trade, some of that, in terms of legal trade, a lot of that in illegal trade, this Asian financial crisis hits. In 2000, elections were held in Burma. The NLD won 60% of the vote, but the ruling junta ignored the results. In 2005, they opened a brand new capital at a brand new capital city called Naypyidaw, halfway between Rangoon and Mandalay. In 2006, the U.S. Led a resolution in the UN Security Council against Burma, and China vetoed it. So it was not passed because of China's veto in the UN Security Council. And not surprisingly, Burma then awarded the building of a natural gas pipeline to China, and this is going through Burma. In 2007, there were more protests in Burma, a new constitution in 2008, and when President Obama came to power, in the years 2008 and 2009, the U.S. began to ease relations, but actually very little was accomplished in our relations with Burma. In 2009, the junta announced a roadmap to democracy, and it issued a new constitution which the NLD disliked because it would have had the president being elected indirectly, the armed forces would have had 1/4 of the legislative seats, etc. Well, anyhow, 2010, elections were held. They were considered fraudulent by many. There was no international supervision of those. Nonetheless, Aung San Suu Kyi was released from house arrest. And the next year, in 2011, the military junta, the 49-year military junta, ended, and U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton visited Myanmar. In 2012, there were free internationally supervised elections, and Aung San Suu Kyi became a member of parliament. She met President Obama in 2014. Any questions, please feel free to email or phone me. I'm always happy to help. Thank you, and have a good week.